Hello and welcome. My name is Brian Caplen, editor of The Banker. I'm with Kimberley Long, who's the Asia editor, and we're discussing the September issue of The Banker magazine. Now, Kimberley, you've written the cover story. This is the Sibos issue, and you've focused on Asian trade. So give us a little bit of an update on what changes are taking place in Asian trade.
So I suppose the big issue that everyone knows about in Asia at the moment is really the China-US trade conflict.
Yeah, which is obviously making the headlines.
Yes, but I think really beyond that, there's a much bigger story that's happening. So there's been a lot of diversification of trade and manufacturing that's happening over the last few years. And while the US trade conflict with China has really kind of pushed this, actually it's been a long-term process now. There's been a lot of manufacturing moving out of China.
Right, and this is because of cost, presumably?
Yeah, that's the main thing. China's just too expensive now in terms of the employment, and also the Chinese government's really looking to upskill as well. They want to have a more high-tech manufacturing base rather than just a traditional.
So where is all this manufacturing going to then?
So we're seeing a lot of move out into Vietnam in particular is really getting a lot of the trade from this. But actually that in itself is causing problems now. It's almost exporting too much to the US, and the US are possibly going to start looking at implementing tariffs on it in the same way as they did with China.
So you need to get a sufficient amount of manufacturing, but not so much to annoy Donald Trump.
Exactly,
okay.
Yeah.
All right, now tell us a little bit about the financing, because there's always been a bit of a trade finance gap, hasn't there?
Yes.
And insufficient funds for all the trade that could be done. Is that a problem in Asia these days?
Yes, completely. Like globally, it's around $1.5 trillion deficit, and I think around 40% of that is currently in Asia. So there's a huge deficit for the amount of funding that's available to finance the amount of trade that's happening. So really the question is how to get this money circulating in order to meet the demand.
And some of this is due presumably to the re-regulation that's occurred since the financial crisis, and much tougher now on sort of anti-money laundering sanctions and those kinds of things. Is that what's hitting the trade finance?
It is, yeah. So the correspondent banking networks just aren't what they were a few years ago. So that's really having to look to see if the international banks want to move back in again, and if not, who's going to pick up the slack? All
right. So you mentioned alternative forms of finance. I mean, what do you mean by that?
Well, there's going to be some examples for trade becoming an asset class is something that's really been under discussion in the last few years, of having alternative sources of finance like the institutional investors and pension funds coming in to supply the financing for this. But we're really in early stages with this, and there's still this huge trade deficit.
Thank you very much, Kimberley. So Asian trade and its changing nature and how it's going to be financed, that's the cover story for the Banker's September issue, which will also be the issue that's at Sibos. Thank you very much for listening.